turns out most of what I have to do today is video editing. So I've got a bit of time on my hands, and I'm trying to do multiple videos, one more produced, one less effort each day. And Fuck This Gay Earth takes a lot less time to do because it's a live stream. So it occurs to me that a lot of people turning up here, mostly to troll me, don't perhaps understand why I'm so anti-censorship and why I'm so anti-online bullying, hate mobs, deplatforming, cancelling people, all that kind of thing. So it occurs to me that it might be worth going over some of that more informally. So this is likely to be rambly because I'm just completely making it up off the top of my head, but here we go. The reason I'm so anti-censorship is because I'm a role player, and I find it disturbing and deeply, deeply disappointing whenever people in the gaming industry become the kind of censorious, moralizing, authoritarian fuckwits that we used to rail against. So, I was born in the mid-70s, grew up in the 80s and 90s, so 90s were my formative teenage years, I guess, but the 80s were important too. And at that time, there was still the satanic panic around gaming and heavy metal and basically anything that I liked. And there was a lot of moralizing fuss over video nasties and all sorts. So I grew up in a fairly censorious culture. Now the satanic panic wasn't quite as bad here in the UK as it was in the US, but even so there were still book burnings, there were still gaming groups that got banned from meeting in certain places like church halls, village halls, scout huts, things like that. There were leaflets given out to the police telling them that role-playing was somehow something to do with cult activity and so on, you know, copies of the same kind of material that was going around in the US because of pat pulling. And at the time, the role-playing community came together very strongly against the claims made against it, that it was satanic or that it promoted suicide or whatever. You know, they went to the science, they made the arguments, they stood up for themselves, and all things considered, it never was as bad as it could have been. Now, this whole experience really instilled in me a massively distrustful approach towards any kind of censorship. And censorship is anything that suppresses speech. It's not just the government, it can be corporations, it can be protest groups, it can be activism. All of these kinds of things can suppress speech and thus be censorship. One particularly formative experience I had was in secondary school. We had religious education lessons, and occasionally someone would be brought in to do a talk or something, or we would read about a different world religion. One time when we had one of these talks, it was one of those kind of stereotypical youth pastors who's down with the kids, and had his guitar and everything with him. Fortunately, he didn't play it, but what he did do was he presented a video to us called Doorways to Danger. You can find copies of that on YouTube if you look for it. Though I think there must have been different versions, because the version I saw was slightly different. But it went into all these things that are supposedly doorways to the occult and ways that lead to Satan. And you can imagine the kind of stuff that was on there: tarot cards, role-playing games, fantasy and science fiction books, heavy metal music. And we took the guy to task over this, and we tore him apart. And we were only 14 or 15 at the time, and he didn't have any good arguments. And it's that kind of moment of solidarity against bullshit really kind of stands out in my mind, as does the unity of the role-playing community against censorship. And so my distrust of censorship is a kind of central plank of my ethical structure. I think the only justification for censorship is the harm principle. Something has to rise to the level of causing harm in order for you to be justified in censoring it. So horror films, anything you voluntarily take part in, anything you voluntarily imbibe as your media content, that's entirely voluntary. You can stop watching, you can leave the gaming table, you can stop reading, whatever it is. You, the reader, the consumer, the viewer, the player, you are the person who ultimately has control over what you consume. Nobody can really force you, short of strapping you down Clockwork Orange style and prying your eyes open. Of course, ironically, Clockwork Orange was banned in this country for a very long time due to supposed copycat killings. And weirdly, that was at the behest of Kubrick, not actual government censorship per se, which just goes to show, I think. But the point is, I've always been very anti-censorship, and something has to rise to the level of harm before I think it's justified to censor it. And this goes for things that I personally don't like, or wouldn't do, or wouldn't consume. I have the ability to understand that just because something disgusts or upsets me doesn't mean that it shouldn't exist. Now, my trolls like to accuse me of seeing myself as better than everybody, or having a more evolved sense of right and wrong, or the ability to set aside my emotions or whatever. Okay, fine. It is a more evolved position to understand that just because I don't like something doesn't mean it's a huge social and moral ill that must be expunged, deleted, burned down, whatever the case might be. And a lot of people seem to have a very hard time understanding that, or they seek to justify their own dislike for something by redressing it as some kind of social problem. I mean, that's what we saw with Anita Sarkeesian and other video game critics. They took their own personal dislike for something and span that into some kind of huge societal patriarchal problem which simply doesn't exist, and then use that to justify censorship and so on. Right, gaming is for everyone. Not each game is for everyone. There are games that I don't like. There are games that I think are disgusting or rancid, or if I had my druthers perhaps wouldn't be allowed. But I recognise that they're for other people, not me. Live and let live. Right? That's not a hard concept to grasp, one would think. So the other half of, I guess, what's going on is people don't understand why I would defend someone who they think has done something awful from the online mob. Now, as it turns out, the accusations towards this guy at UK Games Expo don't appear to actually be true. This whole fuss seems to be based on a misapprehension. But the fact remains, even if he had done what he's been accused of doing, I would still be defending him. On the censorship basis, for one, because the players can always get up and leave the table. You have a responsibility for what you consume. And when you sit down at a game labelled 18+ that's about horror, that to me constitutes consent. You can withdraw that consent by leaving the table or whatever, but you are consenting to horrific content. Well, I'm getting off track again a bit. Anyway, as a consequence of this, this guy is being cancelled, right? So disinvited, not allowed into the convention. It's over now. The various other aspects of their life are being dragged up and blasted all over social media. So why would I be against that? Well, I think that's cruel and unusual and horrible, and possibly even rises to the level of harm, thereby meeting my harm principle. And I'm against that, and I will defend people from that because I have been a victim of it, right? So back in 2010 or so is when I first noticed this kind of attitude creeping in. At that time, it was still pretty much a minority. And that minority was often laughed at. But then in the years since, it's gotten serious. Around 2012, I think, I I penned an article with a clickbaity title called "In Defense of Rape." Now, obviously, it wasn't in defense of the act of rape. What it was a reaction to one of the kind of early social justice fusses that really took off on social media, which was criticizing an implied sexual violence scene in the reboot of Lara Croft, of Tomb Raider. And the actual content of the article, which was meant to be a series of articles, I think I did write the second one, In Defense of Murder, but the gist of the article was that free expression is important. People should be free to address dark topics and to explore sexual violence and torture and or anything, basically. Bad things happening in fiction isn't equivalent to bad things happening in real life, and it's an aspect of storytelling, and it's important, and we shouldn't control or censor it. That was the gist of the article. To this day, most people haven't read past the title. So yeah, that's many years now I've been defending free speech, and particularly in this space. But as a result of that article, and people not reading past the title, I got tons of hate mail. I got petitions trying to get various companies not to work with me freelance anymore. I got slandered horribly across social media and forums, many of which I couldn't have any right of reply to or explanation. So people have attempted to burn my life down, and things have gotten worse since then, more far-reaching. And this harassment and bullying of me has never actually stopped. And the stories get worse and worse, the assumptions get worse and worse. I mean, these people will pick over old tweets, they will pick over work you did 20 years ago, looking for something that's impolitic in the current zeitgeist and holding you up for that. It's relentless, it's autistic in its singular focus, and even though in all things considered it actually did me some good financially and so on, in terms of my mental health it was ruinous, and that was one of the first times I was pushed to the edge of suicide due to the combination of my depression and this relentless lying and bullying and attempts to burn my life and my hobby down. So I'm always going to step up against censorship, and that's because I identify that anti-censorship, anti-authoritarian, anti-moralistic, anti-puritanical stance with the role-playing community, which is why it is so distressing and disappointing when people within an industry that should know better go along with it. And I'm always going to be against online mobbing and bullying and deplatforming and burning people's lives down, because I've been on the receiving end of it, right? And it is horrendous and it's inexcusable, and yet you still think you're the good guys. And it's happening more and more, particularly around American politics, right? I think something blew up over the weekend or something, that the guy who made the drunk Pelosi video has been unearthed, doxed, threatened. Turns out to be a working class black man. Doesn't make any difference. Now, his appreciation for Trump is something I cannot get behind, and the video was stupid, but so what? He has his right to free expression, and he shouldn't be hounded or have his life burned down because of what he did. And the same goes for this thing at UK Games Expo. Not that what's claimed happened appears to have actually happened, but even so, if it had, I would still be defending his rights as a creator, and I would still be saying that this mob is wrong, because I've been on the receiving end of it, right? Sooner or later, you are going to kill someone by doing this. People's hobbies are important to them. People's creativity is important to them. When you go destroying their lives, maybe their livelihood in some cases, taking away something that they love, their hobby and so on, you're taking away a piece of their identity, you're taking away something that gives them relief from the stresses and horrors of everyday life. And sooner or later you're going to kill someone. You nearly killed me. Well done. Yeah, and that does rise to the level of the harm principle. This horrendous bullying and this new tactic, especially of trying to get people's friends and cohorts and family to disown them. It's awful, and yet you think you're the good guys. You're not the good guys. Was it, quote, Milton's Paradise Lost, how awful goodness is. Yes, you're awful, and you think you're good. Kill them all, let God sort them out, right? This is the kind of thinking that excuses massacres. If someone did kill themselves over this, over what you do to them, I don't think you'd probably, most of you, showed the slightest hint of guilt or concern whatsoever. You'd probably think it was justified, and that's horrendous. But if you wonder why, right, I'm always found at the forefront of protecting people who have done what you think are shitty things, or standing between them and the mob, that's why. I am absolutely dead set against censorship, unless something rises to the level of meeting the harm principle. And having been the victim of the mob, I don't want anyone else to feel as alone and burned and lied about as I was. I don't want anyone else to be pushed right to that edge that I was. This isn't me being an edgelord. I will stand up for things that disgust me, like lolly porn, right? Nobody is hurt. They're drawings, right? It might disgust me, but so fucking what? It's not for me. So it's not me being an edgelord or controversial for the sake of it. I believe in free expression. I believe in people's maximum liberty to enjoy the things that they enjoy, so long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. And I don't want anyone else driven to that edge that I have been more than once by you assholes. Those are my red lines, right? Just the same way your red lines might be sexual violence or whatever, but nobody can be hurt at a table. It is literally the safest environment in which to explore these, whether for your own psychological health or by storytelling. And there is no justification for burning someone's life down over a social faux pas. And fuck you if you think there is. And don't ever doubt my sincerity in my honest hatred of your censorious, authoritarian, moral busybodying. Alright? It's genuine. And it's not from a position of trying to be edgy or whatever else you want to throw at me. I really believe these things. I hate censorship and I hate online mobbing. I hate people being cancelled. Loathe it. Can't understand it. And sooner or later, you are going to kill someone.